Hello, a very good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our Defined Benefit Funding Code consultation webinar. It's great to see so many of you in attendance today. We ran a similar event for our first consultation back in the summer of 2020, which feels like a long time ago now, and I'm pleased to see both new and returning people in the audience today. It's always good to attend these for your CPD record, but we know that these are important issues and not the easiest to engage with, so we hope you find today helpful. We've also upgraded to a lovely sofa for this session, rather than you all getting a sneak peek inside our houses, as was the lockdown norm. So what are we going to cover? Well, we have a great panel of people here that will run through the key elements of the draft DB funding code and also our proposed twin track approach to assessing valuations, namely fast track and bespoke. I'm sure many of you have been to other webinars where people have talked you through the draft regs and the bumper package that we published in December. So today we're going to try and keep our presentations relatively brief, but still give a high-level overview which we hope is helpful, and leave plenty of room for questions and discussion on the panel. In terms of the agenda, we'll start with some scene setting, and you'll hear from David Fairs shortly. We'll then discuss some of the detail in the code and the long-term planning requirements, specifically looking at the funding and investment strategy, or FIS for short. Then we'll turn our attention to look at other aspects of the valuation, including setting technical provisions and recovery plans, and how elements of the long-term planning should be integrated into schemes' funding solutions. We'll then have the first of two Q&A sessions, before we then look at our proposed regulatory approach and dig a bit deeper into the design of fast track. And that will be followed by a second Q&A. We do want to have some good Q&A sessions, so please do submit your questions and comments as we go. Be nice, please. We will try and get to as many as we can in either of our two sessions. To submit your questions, I'm reliably informed that you can just click on the box below your video player, type your question, and then press submit. As ever with our webinars, please don't worry too much about capturing all the information and furiously writing it all down. We will direct you to some online resources with useful links and a copy of these slides sometime after the session. We'll also include an opportunity to feedback on the session itself. The survey is actually already available at the top of the menu on the left-hand side of the video player. Hopefully you can see it there. We'd be very grateful if you would fill this out before you leave, even if you can't stay with us until the very end. It's really helpful for us in terms of improving these events and making sure they are as useful as possible. So to begin, I'd like to welcome David Fairs, who is, for the next couple of weeks anyway, our Executive Director of Regulatory Policy Analysis and Advice. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Chris. I'm so pleased to be part of this. As many of you'll know, I'm leaving TPR in a few weeks. And it's appropriate to be wrapping up by returning to something that I started working on when I joined. Before we get into the detail, two very big thank yous from me. Thank you for joining this webinar today, and thank you to all those of you out there who've helped to make the last 4.5 years so interesting and fruitful for me. I joined TPR a few months after DWP published their 2018 DB funding white paper. That paper introduced a package of measures to focus trustees on long-term planning and risk management. It also gave TPR tools to take more efficient and effective regulatory action. And since then, we've been considering how we best build off the developing legislation to embed the existing good practice seen in the market and create a clear funding standard. One that's flexible enough to allow trustees to adapt to scheme-specific funding approaches, but raises the floor of minimum compliance for the small number who misuse the flexibilities in the existing system. This is our second consultation on DB funding, and I remember introducing the webinar we ran for the first consultation, where we set out our initial proposals for a clearer, more readily enforceable funding framework. We ran the webinar from our homes on a hot summer afternoon as the UK was slowly emerging from lockdown restrictions. And it's such a peculiar memory, but the fact that the industry was able to get on board and help input into our proposals, despite those strange times, speaks volumes of our shared determination to improve. And a lot's happened since DWP published its white paper. Developing policy takes time, and we've evolved our thinking to reflect several things: developing legislation, responses to our first consultation, and our own analysis. We've also had many opportunities to see how our proposed approach stands up to real-world events and the DB landscape, whether that's Brexit, COVID-19 pandemic, 4 British Prime Ministers, war in Ukraine, economic challenges and market uncertainty. And despite this evolving backdrop, or perhaps it's better to say because of what we've learned from these events, we continue to believe that the direction of travel from the draft DWP regulations and our draft code remains the right one. Long-term planning and risk management remain key tenets of good scheme management across all market conditions. We published our second consultation in December and now consulting on the draft code itself. We've also set out our proposed twin-track approach to addressing valuations and provided granular detail on how we see fast-track working. In this webinar, we'll clarify our proposals, listen to your questions, and take into consideration your comments. Our proposals are still being developed. We're still listening, questioning, and testing. So please engage today and respond to our consultation if you have something to add. Deadline is 24th of March. Thank you, and now I'll hand back to Chris.
Great, thanks David. So I'm now going to walk you through a brief introduction to our consultation to help set the scene a little more before we start diving in and letting the experts talk to you through some of the details. It's important, I think, to remember why this work is moving forwards, as well as a lot of the how that the regulations and code set out, and we will get into a lot of that today. As David said, the intention has never been about making huge changes in the funding framework or direction of travel for most schemes. Many already do all or most of the sorts of things that are being proposed, but DWP set out the view, and one that we agree with, that they want all schemes to be planning for the longer term, with a focus being on putting themselves in the best position to pay the benefits promised. That's what we want from the regs, and we want our code to help achieve. David mentioned the green and white papers from DWP that led to the Pension Schemes Act 2021. That brought in the primary legislation, and we published our first consultation on how we might reframe the code at around the time that legislation was being debated. There was broad support for the direction and principles that we set out in our first consultation, but there was some concern over some of the proposals and the need for more detail, which is fair. We think is fair, as the draft regs were not yet in place, and our consultation was relatively high level with the aim of just starting that conversation. DWP have since published their consultation on the draft secondary regulations, and they are working their way through the responses. And we published our consultation package at the end of December, the early Christmas present I suspect very few of you had on your list for Santa. And it's not usual that we would publish drafts of the code itself while the regs are not yet finalised, but we thought it would be helpful, useful for industry to see how we were interpreting those regulations and the sorts of expectations that we might have of schemes in light of them. This, we hope, gives a more complete picture of what the new requirements may mean for you and for your schemes, and enables, I think, a better level of feedback in response to that. So this will be helpful both for us in developing the code, but also for DWP, who we are working closely with on the regulations themselves. And of course, any changes to the final regulations will, of course, need to be reflected in the code itself as well. A question we get asked a lot is when will all of this come into effect? The earliest we expect the code and regulations to be enforced is towards the end of 2023, the end of this year. But there's a lot still to do to get all of this ready. And we, of course, expect a number of interested responses to our consultation. I think we broke TPR's record with the first one, so hopefully we can better that. But importantly, ours and DWP's priority is to get it right and make sure our code is as clear as it can be, and to make sure that everyone has the time needed to prepare. All the changes will be forward-looking, of course, so the current regulations, code and guidance remain in place until that point. So on to the code itself. I will give a quick intro before I hand over to the others, along with a summary of the regulations and an outline of the funding regime. The code is split into two main sections. Firstly, long-term planning for schemes, and then secondly, its application in practice, including valuations and recovery plans. The first of these sections is where we discuss the new requirements in the regulations for a funding and investment strategy, the FIS. This has a number of different elements that we break down in detail in the code, but the key overarching principle is that schemes should be setting out a plan for how to get to a point of low dependency on the employer by significant maturity. And alongside that, to have a journey plan to reach that point, taking supportable risk along the way, and employer covenant being a key aspect of achieving that. So we will cover much of these elements today, as those aspects are the main new bits, I would say, flowing from the regulations. So a large part of our code is focused on how we expect schemes to go about setting that destination and their plans to get there. The next section of the code covers more of the practical applications of how the FIS should be reflected in the scheme's valuation and in the trustees' decision making. Much of the regs have not changed on these aspects and reflects the existing approach that we all know and love to statutory funding objective, technical provisions and recovery plans. But there is an interaction between those areas and the FIS, so we are encouraging trustees to consider all these elements together. The regs also introduced the requirement for recovering deficits as quickly as is reasonably affordable by the employer, a phrase that I'm sure is not new to many of you, but is for the first time put explicitly on a legislative footing. And so we have set out how we are interpreting that, what we would expect of schemes in that area. So I'm now pleased to introduce our next two speakers. We have Andrew Dodd, who's a lead actuary here at TPR, and Katrina Martland, a lead covenant and financial analyst at TPR. And they will run through some of these key areas of the draft code in more detail. Andrew.
Thanks, Chris. As part of the funding and investment strategy, or FIS, that Chris just mentioned, the draft regulations introduce the principle that schemes must aim to reach a position of low dependency on the employer by the time they are significantly mature. Low dependency means that no further employer contributions are expected to be needed in reasonably foreseeable circumstances. However, this is not a guarantee that contributions will never be needed. To do this, the regulations require that each scheme plans to be invested in a low dependency investment allocation and to be fully funded on a low dependency funding basis no later than the point of significant maturity. So let's look at each of those elements now. Firstly, the low dependency investment allocation. There are two aspects to this set out in the draft regulations: broad cash flow matching with the benefit payments, and the funding level of the scheme being highly resilient to short-term adverse changes in market movements. Let's look at each of these in turn. For broad cash flow matching, we explain in the code that this is not exact cash flow matching. Some cash flow matching combined with high levels of hedging for interest rates and inflation, consistent with the liabilities, would in our view meet the definition. When it comes to being highly resilient, we expect trustees to carry out a suitable level of analysis to enable them to assess their resilience. As a minimum, we expect schemes to test for a 1-year, 1 in 6 stress scenario, with the assumption they are fully funded on a low dependency funding basis. We expect this test to show a change in the funding level of no more than 4.5%. The implications of our expectations in the draft code are some allocation to growth assets can be appropriate. Matching assets can be leveraged to some extent to increase the level of hedging, and matching assets also need to do more than match the duration of the liabilities. Trustees need to appreciate the need to hedge across the cash flow profile of the liabilities yield curve as well. Underpinning all of this is proportionality. What we expect trustees to do depends on the situation of the scheme. As the scheme approaches its relevant date, the level of detail needed increases, and the accuracy of matching assets should reflect the size of the scheme, its governance arrangements, and the proportion invested in growth assets. A key point to note is that this is a planned investment strategy. there may be good reasons for mature schemes not to invest in accordance with the low dependency investment allocation. However, we would expect in most cases trustees will invest consistently. Let's move on to the low dependency funding basis. The assumptions in this basis must be set assuming the scheme is invested in that low dependency investment allocation, and if the scheme was fully funded, no employer contributions would be needed under reasonably foreseeable circumstances. In the draft code, we explained that there is no limit on the maximum discount rate that could be used. Instead, the limit is based on the prudent returns that the scheme can achieve on its low dependency investment allocation. This allows both for a dynamic discount rate approach when the scheme has cash flow matching assets and a risk-free rate plus a margin approach where the scheme has or intends to match the cash flows more broadly. There is also no prescription on the other actuarial assumptions. We've provided guidance on how schemes should set those assumptions, allowing for the scheme-specific nature of many of them. And we've also provided some guidance on expenses. Where there is no requirement in the scheme's rules for the employer to meet those expenses, then the trustees should include a reserve for them. Where there is such a requirement, the trustees should still consider it. Finally, I want to talk about significant maturity. Trustees must set a relevant date by which time they plan to have low dependency on the employer, and this date must be no later than the point of significant maturity. I want to talk a little about scheme maturity first. As we explained in our first consultation on the code, there are different ways of measuring the maturity of the scheme. The draft regulations require maturity to be measured using the duration of liabilities, which is a weighted average of when all future benefit payments will be made from the scheme. This means the lower the number of years of duration, the more mature the scheme is. Under the draft regulations, the exact definition of significant maturity is to be set by us in our code. In the draft code, we have set that to be the time when the scheme's duration reaches 12 years. So the time when the average weighted time to the remaining benefit payments is 12 years away. However, the volatility in the bond markets over the last year has highlighted one of the downsides of using this measure, that it is sensitive to market conditions, which can make it difficult for schemes to do long-term planning. The increases and decreases we saw in bond yields over the autumn of last year meant we saw schemes' periods until expecting to reach duration 12 move by a few years over just a few days. The DWP is considering changing what the regulations say on measuring maturity to help reduce this volatility and help with trustees' planning. In our consultation document, we have set out 3 alternative approaches that could be adopted to help with that. All of these assume the DWP sticks with using duration as the measure of maturity. I'm now going to pass over to Katrina, who is going to talk about how we expect trustees to assess employer covenant.
Thank you, Andrew. For the first time, employer covenant has been recognised explicitly in legislation as a key underpin for supportable risk. Given this, the code looks to build on the definition of covenant as set out in the regulations and to provide clear guidance to trustees on how they should be assessing employer covenant. To do this, trustees must consider the employer's free cash flow, as defined in the code. This assessment should focus on management's forecast cash flow information, including the appropriateness of the assumptions underpinning the forecasts. They should also consider the employer's prospects, including the employer's market outlook and its position within its market, the employer's balance sheet resilience, ESG, and the likelihood of an insolvency event. And finally, they should consider any contingent asset support provided to the scheme, assuming it is legally enforceable and sufficient to provide the level of support when required. We are not making any fundamental changes to what covenant is or how it should be assessed. We are simply embedding what most trustees are already doing as good practice and developing the way in which we expect trustees to present employer covenant support. To support the code, we're also in the process of updating our existing covenant guidance to expand on these areas further and to provide more examples to bring this to life. The guidance will also look to consolidate existing covenant guidance and recent covenant blogs, with the aim of making it easier for trustees to find relevant information when needed. We expect to consult on this guidance in due course. The code will also introduce 3 timeframes that trustees should consider as part of their covenant assessment. Visibility. This refers to the period over which trustees have visibility over their employer forecasts. This is typically 1 to 3 years. Reliability over available cash. This refers to the period over which trustees have reasonable certainty of the employer's available cash to fund the scheme. For most employers, we expect reliability to extend only over the medium term, say 3 to 6 years. However, we appreciate that for some, this may be longer or shorter. This period is particularly important when determining an appropriate journey plan and recovery plan. And finally, covenant longevity. This refers to the maximum period that trustees can reasonably assume that the employer will remain in existence to support the scheme. For most schemes, this is likely to be up to 10 years. Again, we acknowledge for some this may be different. Although we expect all trustees to assess the strength of employer covenant, we do highlight in the code and in the new covenant guidance with some practical examples the importance of taking a proportionate approach to this assessment and the detailed analysis required. For example, if the scheme is well funded and small relative to the size of the employer, then less scrutiny may be required when assessing covenant than if the scheme was poorly funded and large relative to the employer. Trustees should document their decision around proportionality. Finally, for trustees to evidence that the risk being taken by the scheme is supportable, it is no longer sufficient to provide a single covenant rating, which can be very subjective. Instead, trustees will be required to consider each aspect of covenant, cash, prospects and contingent asset support, and be prepared to provide their analysis and conclusions to the pension regulator if required. I'll now hand over to Andrew, who will talk you through the journey plan.
Thanks, Katrina. The journey plan is for schemes who are not already in the low dependency state that we looked at earlier. A scheme's journey plan describes how it will progress from its current funding and investment strategy to low dependency. The draft regulations require that the level of a scheme's funding and investment risk taken along this journey depends primarily on the strength of the employer covenant and secondly on its maturity. The stronger the covenant, the more risk that can be supported, and a more immature scheme can take more risk as it has more time until it will reach significant maturity. Trustees will need to assure themselves the level of risk taken is supportable. In this slide, we will look at the investment strategy and we'll cover the funding strategy and what that means for technical provisions next. Broadly, the more risk the scheme takes in its investment strategy, the higher the potential returns, but also the greater the downsides could be. The trustees need to consider the level of risk they want in their journey plan. And this will depend not only on the level of risk that can be supported, but by their appetite for risk and the sponsor's appetite for risk. Our code sets out a boundary for the maximum level of risk we think a scheme can run in a strategy. This is demonstrated in this chart and can be considered in 3 periods. Over the period of covenant reliability, where there is a reasonable confidence of the employer's ability to support the scheme, trustees can take investment risk up to the maximum level. After the period of covenant reliability, the trustees need to plan to reduce the level of risk they are taking. From a point in time no later than significant maturity, trustees need to plan to take risks in line with the low dependency investment allocation. In the code, we explain in more detail the framework for how trustees can determine the maximum supportable risk over that initial period of covenant reliability. This involves considering what would happen to the scheme in an adverse scenario. Where that scenario leads to a deficit, which requires additional contributions to be paid to the scheme to return it to full funding, the maximum risk is calculated based on the additional maximum affordable contributions that would be available over that period of covenant reliability. We also set out how trustees should plan to de-risk after that initial period. If a scheme is taking the maximum level of risk, we expect trustees to look to reduce that risk gradually over time until the point of significant maturity. We've just talked a lot about maximum supportable risk, but there are many reasons why a scheme may choose to take less risk than the maximum. Each scheme should pick the journey plan that is right for them, and we are not prescribing an approach to setting journey plans. So we've looked at long-term planning and the FIS. Now we will look at other aspects of the valuation, including setting technical provisions and recovery plans, which Katrina will cover later. We will consider how elements of a long-term planning should be integrated into schemes funding solutions. Legislation requires that technical provisions, or TPs, must be set to be consistent with the FIS. This means we expect the assumptions used to calculate TPs to be consistent with the investment strategy under the journey plan before the scheme's relevant date, and the low dependency investment allocation after the relevant date. The graph shows an example of a shape of the TP's discount rate used each year. This is based on a scheme taking the maximum supportable risk that we looked at in the last slide. And the discount rates have been set based on the prudent expected returns on that investment strategy. As before, there are three periods to consider. The period of covenant reliability, where the discount rates can be the highest level. After the period of covenant reliability, where the discount rate should be reduced, reflecting the investment strategy. And finally, after the relevant date, a point no later than significant maturity, where the discount rate should be no higher than in a low dependency funding basis. Although we have shown the example of discount rates being aligned with the investment strategy, consistent does not mean the discount rates must reflect the strategy. A more prudent basis can be used. For example, a low dependency funding basis could be used throughout the lifetime of the scheme, or something in between the expected returns on the investment strategy and low dependency. However, the discount rate should not allow for returns higher than expected under the scheme's FIS. For example, the scheme should not assume that the initial blue line of discount rates will never reduce if that is not what the scheme is planning for. You'll see in this chart there is a second dotted line. This is an example of how discount rates could be set differently for an open scheme. Open schemes have new accrual and potentially new entrants as well. We've explained in our code that trustees could reasonably allow for the new accrual and new entrants over the period of covenant reliability. And when you allow for that, you expect to reach significant maturity later. This can be allowed for in the discount rates, which means that overall the average discount rate over the lifetime of the scheme is higher. This means that for open schemes, the technical provisions can be lower than for an equivalent closed scheme. I'm now going to pass over to Katrina to talk about recovery plans that schemes put in place if they have a deficit.
When considering the appropriateness of a recovery plan, trustees should consider the employer's reasonable affordability, whether to allow for post-valuation experience. This is likely to be acceptable provided a consistent approach is taken to favourable and unfavourable conditions, and that trustees consider the impact this may have on the scheme's assets, liabilities and covenant. And finally, whether to allow for investment outperformance beyond what is already included in the technical provision deficit. Again, this is likely to be acceptable provided any downside risk is supported by the employer covenant or a third-party contingent funding mechanism. For now, I will focus on what we mean by reasonable affordability. First, it is important to reiterate that this is not a new term and has been referred to in previous TPR publications, such as the annual funding statement. However, the draft code will be more prescriptive on how to assess reasonable affordability, allowing for a more consistent approach between schemes. So how do you work out reasonable affordability? There are 3 key steps. First, trustees need to work out what is the employer's available cash. This comprises free cash flow plus liquid assets, such as cash on the balance sheet. Trustees then need to assess the reliability of available cash. This, as discussed earlier, this is the period over which trustees have reasonable certainty over the employer's available cash and is likely to extend only over the medium term. This is key in determining an appropriate recovery plan length and to help trustees understand when it is reasonable for the employer to use available cash for other purposes than deficit repair contributions. Finally, once trustees understand the size of the pot of cash, they need to determine how this should be divided between the scheme and other alternative uses of cash. Alternative uses of cash include investment in sustainable growth, covenant leakage such as dividends, discretionary payments to other stakeholders, for example the early repayment of debt, and payment to other DB schemes. Although these aren't technically discretionary, it is important that trustees ensure that schemes are treated fairly. To help trustees understand if and when it is reasonable to allow for alternative uses of cash, we set out 5 key principles in the code that we expect trustees to adopt. The first 3 principles focus on covenant leakage and discretionary payments. For example, where the scheme is poorly funded or reaching significant maturity, we would expect deficit repair contributions to be prioritised over alternative uses of cash. Therefore, discretionary payments and covenant leakage become less reasonable. Likewise, where the recovery plan exceeds the reliability period, covenant leakage and discretionary payments are less reasonable. The 4th principle highlights the importance of allocating cash between DB schemes fairly and equitably. And the 5th principle focuses on investment in sustainable growth. As you would expect, this principle does allow for more flexibility for employers to invest in sustainable growth versus other alternative uses of cash. However, it is important the trustees understand the benefits that this investment will have on the employer's business and covenant. If this is unclear or uncertain, we would expect trustees to seek further contingent asset support to protect the scheme in the event of a downside scenario. I'm now going to hand over to Chris, who is going to take us through the Q&A.
Thank you both. That was great, and I hope everyone watching found that helpful. We're now going to take a short break to give you a couple of minutes to submit your questions and grab a quick cup of tea or something stronger if you think you need it, before we move on to the first panel discussion. To submit a question, just click on the box under the video player, type your question and press submit. And we'll be back in 2 minutes. Great, welcome back everyone. Before we get started, I would just like to introduce Neil Ball to the panel, who's Head of Investment at TPR, and also Ian O'Toole, a pensions lawyer from TPR as well. I get the easy job now of being able to look at your questions and push any hard-looking ones to the others on the panel. And it's David's last few days, so he can have the especially hard-looking ones. And it looks like we have plenty of questions, so thank you very much for that. So I'm going to get started straight away. So first one I have here, there are lots of new requirements for trustees with the new regulations and code. How are you taking account of small schemes? And I might start with Andrew, if that's okay for that one.
Yes, thanks, Chris. So it may surprise you to hear that just over a third of the schemes that we regulate have less than 100 members. So it is an important part of the universe of schemes that we regulate. And we are aware that small schemes can have quite different issues to those that are a bit larger. So we've been speaking to people who work with those small schemes so we can understand the issues better. And we're very keen that the code does work for small schemes. A key aspect, which is throughout the code, you'll see, is proportionality. You know, we do expect small schemes can take a proportionate approach to the way they approach their strategy.
Great, thank you. I might ask Katrina to add to it. Is there anything around covenant, in particular independent covenant advice for small schemes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important, firstly, to note that our guidance on whether or not trustees should be taking independent covenant advice remains unchanged. So as you'll be aware, we recommend that trustees take covenant advice or independent covenant advice in a situation where either the covenant is particularly complex or where the trustee board themselves don't feel that they have the knowledge or the experience or expertise to be able to assess covenant, or where there may be some potential conflicts of interest or independence issues on the board. Absent that, following on from what Andrew said, there will be certain schemes, particularly small schemes, where they don't feel it's proportionate to be taking independent covenant advice, and that is fine. We are in the process of updating our covenant guidance to be able to provide significantly more detail on the 3 key pillars of covenant, so cash, contingent assets and prospects, to help those trustees that are doing it themselves. One of the things I would like to note even, is it's really important, regardless of whether you're taking independent covenant advice or not, that trustees are documenting and can evidence why they've made a certain decision. And this is particularly important when the scheme is taking a higher level of risk than is acceptable under fast track, but also when you might have a reliability period that extends beyond the medium term.
Great, thank you very much. That's really, really helpful. I'm going to move on to the second question. This one looks quite tricky, so I'm going to give it to you, David, straight away. What's the latest on the likely effective date for this new regime? Is it still 1st of October? Also, when will the consultation on covenant guidance and form of statement of strategy commence?
So look, we've still got the ambition that the code will go live later this year. Critically, of course, it depends on DWP laying the regulations. The latest conversations we've had with DWP, they're very much on track to get the regulations laid before summer recess. So that's a fundamental foundation, if you like, for us to move forward with the code. In terms of the other bits, the guidance around investment, covenant, and the consultation on the statement of strategy, that will take place in the summer. Having said that, Chris, one thing that the 4.5 years at TPR has taught me is many things can happen, as I said at the beginning. So that's the ambition. Obviously, we'll just have to see how things plan out.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bring Ian in now. Welcome, Ian, to the panel.
Thank you.
What new obligations do employers have under the regulations?
Under the regulations, the employer does have to agree the funding and investment strategy with the trustees. So we would expect that there would be a level of negotiations between the employer and the trustees in order to agree that. With regard to the Part 2 statement of strategy, that is not a requirement for the employer to agree, but the employer must be consulted on that by the trustees. And should the employer wish to make any representations which would be included in the final document on that statement, then they can choose to do so.
Excellent, thank you. And to bring the other new face, Neil, although everyone will know you, I'm sure. Are you concerned that the DB funding code will force all pension funds to invest in government bonds?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think, first of all, it's worth saying that pension funds are already, on average, quite a long way on their journey towards de-risking, and that's partly because some of them have matured and also potentially reached levels of better funding. So to give some numbers on that, about 72% of assets are in bonds at the current time. So I don't see this as a way of forcing schemes into bonds. A lot of them are already in bonds anyway for very good reasons independent of the code. But I think it is important to remember that we're looking at investment from a risk point of view. We're not trying to direct investments to tell schemes what to invest in and what not to invest in. We are looking at it from a risk point of view. And it's not just government bonds that might provide a useful place as schemes mature. There's corporate bonds and indeed the whole area of illiquids that many schemes are investing in as well. So I think the takeaway is more about thinking about the level of risk about where schemes want to be rather than thinking about individual asset classes.
Great, thank you. The next question I have is quite a long one, so bear with me, apologies. With the proposed reduced focus on formal covenant grades, what changes are likely to be made to the annual scheme return where a covenant grading question was brought in recent years? Will this be replaced, and if so, with what? Katrina, is that okay if you take that one?
Absolutely. So We are in the process of discussing internally what information we will be asking from trustees even, when it comes down to their submission, their valuation submission, but also through other submissions at the moment. So once we have agreed upon that, we will be consulting externally on that.
Great, thank you. The next one's a very long question, which I'm going to paraphrase, if that's okay. Apologies to the questioner if I paraphrase it incorrectly. But how does the code work with discretionary increases? David, can I ask you to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. And I think the question is posed in the context of schemes that are approaching buyout. Obviously, as others said, we've got much better funding levels after the events of last year, so more schemes are in a position where they can buy out. But it's perfectly acceptable for trustees either to decide to buy out or to actually run on their pension scheme. And one of the reasons why they might choose to run the pension scheme on is to benefit from those improved funding positions and provide discretionary pension increases. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is to recognise absolutely that it's a very difficult environment, very high levels of inflation, and many schemes are providing capped levels of increases. But it's not really for us as a regulator to impose on employers or trustees a requirement to provide discretionary increases. That really is a matter between the employer and the trustees, as I say. But where that agreement is in place, then actually the trustees may choose to run the scheme on as opposed to buy out, where it's much more difficult to contemplate discretionary pension increases.
Great, thank you. Next one's a much shorter and simpler question. Well, it might not be simple, but it's shorter. Andrew, this will be coming to you. What do we understand as the maturity date?
Yeah, so it's a bit earlier on we talked about the maturity and what's in the regulations about being duration. Now, people will recall if they looked at our first consultation on the code that we did consult on various different measures. We did get the feedback from that consultation was that duration was the least worst of those. I mean, they all have their downsides, but appreciate that duration is quite a sort of complicated concept. It's something that actuaries like, but maybe not so clear to the trustees, the layperson. So perhaps a good way of thinking about it is think about the other kind of maturity measures and what a duration of 12 years means. And broadly, it's about when about 80% of your members are pensioners, or you're at a time where you're paying out about 5 or 6% of your assets as benefits each year. So if you want to think about it in a different way, you can think about it like that.
Great, thank you. And I think I'm right in saying, in terms of some of those questions and issues around the use of duration, we've included some narrative and questions in our consultation documents as well.
We have, yeah, we have, and we're currently working with DWP to look at what might be the best way to make this work when the final regulations come in.
Great, thank you. Next one looks very much for you, Neil, if that's okay. What's the rationale for going for a 1 in 6 VAR when the industry tends to use something like 1 in 20?
Sure. So that's a great question, and it's certainly true that the industry does use a number of different measures, but a 1 in 20 might be considered to be typical. I think there's two answers to this one, really. One is that we'll talk about fast track a little bit later, but we did want to make an investment test rather than introduce a new one and create additional burden. We wanted to kind of use a test that was already familiar to some pension schemes, and that's the PPF stress test, which is run at a 1 in 6. So that's kind of a practical, pragmatic reason. But I think it goes further than that. I've seen, in my experience, lots of schemes will run a 1 in 20 number, and then they might forget about it or dismiss it because, by definition, it's quite unlikely to happen. I think that's harder to do when it's a 1 in 6 number. It's a figure that really, our hope is that trustees should start to think about in the context of other metrics about the pension scheme. So, as I say, a pragmatic reason and perhaps one that might help schemes think about the risk on an ongoing basis.
Great, thank you. Another slightly longer question. I think this one will probably be coming to you, Andrew, looking at the nature of it. On the low dependency investment allocation, why assume 100% funded with a 4% downside test? If a scheme is 120% funded, why does it need a maximum downside of 4%?
Yeah, that is a good point about surpluses, and does that allow schemes to take a bit more risk if they're running a surplus? You know, they've got a bit of a buffer. We understand from DWP this is something that they got a lot of responses on for their consultation. So they are currently looking at how that might be incorporated in some way in the regulations, and then obviously our code will follow suit in terms of whatever those regulations say.
Great, thank you. Next one, probably start with you, Ian, if that's okay with this one. Why isn't it a requirement in the new code to have a full fat expenses reserve? Without this, by definition, you are still reliant on the employer for contributions beyond the point of significant maturity.
Well, I think in our experience, the trust deed and rules of different schemes will have different requirements in there in terms of expenses and reserves for expenses. We didn't think when we were looking at this that it was our place necessarily to dictate and overrule those trust schemes that don't actually do this. So we thought it was probably the best way forward was to allow some flexibility on that.
Great, thank you. Sorry, slightly longer question again. By setting the LTO as buyout, sponsors will need to plan for being fully funded on a buyout basis by the point of significant maturity. Being realistic, I'm already seeing this happen in practice. Many employers may have this as the ultimate destination, but not one they want to be tied into, so will therefore look to target a low dependency of gilts plus a half. Do you have thoughts on this? I guess what that's saying, I think what that's saying is, will we see employers or schemes look to actually reduce their long-term funding target down to where we've set fast track or down to low dependency when otherwise they may have been looking at something stronger? David, can I ask for your reactions to that?
Well, I think if schemes are ultimately looking to buy out, then to my mind it doesn't make sense either from the trustee's perspective or the employer's perspective for them to push that point where they might achieve a buyout out into the future. So I'd have thought actually where schemes have got the objective of buying out, that they would continue to go down that track. I mean, I suppose behind that, the way you paraphrased it is also, will some schemes choose to level down with the introduction of fast track? And of course, you know, that may be a discussion that the employer and trustees have, particularly if the employer has got some short-term financial stress. But I think, you know, you've got to think, what is your ultimate aim? Where are you trying to get to? As I say, if you're trying to get to buyout, then it seems to me that it probably is in the trustees and the employer's interest to get there as quickly as possible. If the objective is to run the scheme on, you know, you've still got to get to a particular funding level by the point of significant maturity. And if you are in a good position, then actually keeping the momentum going, keeping the contributions flowing in, is going to make that journey a much smoother and more predictable one than if you suddenly take your foot off the accelerator and slow down from the position you are. There is a chance then that at some point in the future you're going to have to put your foot back on the accelerator, increase contributions potentially significantly. And you know that may be at a time when actually you're less certain about whether the employer can support and afford that. So for me, there is a lot of logic, regardless of what target that you're actually going for, of keeping the momentum going. But I do accept in some particular circumstances that some employers, with the consent of the trustees, may slow funding down a little bit.
Great, thank you. Very clear. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Are schemes allowed to roll forward the period of covenant reliability from valuation to valuation? Whilst not in the spirit, does this mean that some schemes may do this, take the maximum level of risk up to significant maturity and then suddenly de-risk? So I think the main question is around, could you roll forward that covenant reliability period from valuation to valuation? Katrine, I might ask you to have first go at that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer is yes, but obviously trustees need to be doing a full covenant assessment every triennial valuation to be able to understand that they are comfortable that the period of reliability is still the same. So it is still 6 years. So as long as they can do that assessment and they can evidence that the trustees have reasonable certainty over available cash for that period, they will be able to continue to take maximum supportable risk. Again, it assumes that the covenant is sufficient to be able to support that level of risk to continue.
Great, thank you. And last questions, another one for you, Andrew. I'm afraid actuaries are popular today. Are you suggesting scheme actuaries move away from a pre-post-retirement discount rate towards a single-term dependent outperformance margin?
Well, we're actually going to come back and talk a bit more about journey plans later in the presentation today. But it's fair to say that no, we're not trying to push schemes down a particular path in terms of term-dependent discount rates. We see that a pre- and post-retirement discount rate approach could definitely work, and with the new regulations and with our guidance in the code, it is definitely for the trustees and the employer of the scheme to agree what's the best strategy for them and what they want to adopt. And I certainly wouldn't say we are pushing trustees down a particular journey plan path. Great, thank you. And so I think that's the end of the questions for this Q&A panel. Thank you very much, everyone, for asking those questions. Thank you very much for everybody for a really good discussion, and I hope you found it helpful as well. We'll now focus on our proposed twin-track regulatory approach to assessing valuations and look more closely at the design of Fast Track itself. So as well as the code itself, as if that wasn't enough for you all, we have a separate consultation document on our approach to assessing valuations. We set out in our first consultation the concept of a fast track and bespoke approach, with fast track aiming to be a more defined approach with key parameters in relation to the valuation and recovery plan, while bespoke allows schemes to set their valuations and recovery plans outside of these defined parameters, but still in line with the regulations and the code. Fast track itself is not in the legislation, so it's not contained within our code, but it is still a key part of the funding regime and how we plan to operate it. So the fast track approach provides more clarity and direction on our view of a level of risk that we will tolerate from a supervisory perspective when we're assessing valuations, and also acts as a filter for our purposes. If a submission meets the fast track parameters, which we've set out in our consultation and we'll discuss in more depth today, then we are unlikely to scrutinise it further or engage with the trustees in respect of that valuation. Our aim is that this will represent a lower burden approach for schemes in submitting their valuations to us. And it will also give comfort to the scheme that they are unlikely to hear from us in relation to that valuation and, if needed, recovery plan. Fast track is not, however, risk-free. It's not designed to be the right approach or the right answer for every scheme in every circumstance. It acts as a regulatory line, and trustees should still follow the principles set out in the code and the same sorts of considerations they would normally have for their scheme when they're carrying out their valuations. Schemes who want to take more risk or do not fit into the fast track parameters can opt for the bespoke approach. And I want to be clear that this is not a second best option. It just means that the scheme is taking a different approach to fast track, and means we are more likely to engage with them, to understand their approach better and understand how trustees are comfortable with the outcome that they've reached. For example, it might be that the sponsor has a high level of affordability and ability to cover a higher level of downside risk than our fast track implies, and the trustees are comfortable with taking that risk. Or at the other end, the sponsor may have some affordability constraints and as a result needs a longer recovery plan than our fast track parameters. Neither of these outcomes should be seen as necessarily a problem. Going bespoke just means that we may want to understand that better, how the trustees got themselves comfortable with their approach, and how that is in line with the expectations in the regulations and the code. This is one area where you may have noticed that we have adjusted our proposals following our first consultation. In that first consultation, we talked about explicitly benchmarking bespoke to fast track. For example, asking schemes to justify the risk they're taking in excess of that in fast track, and that being the main focus of the engagement that we would have with schemes. Following feedback and some further reflection, we've decided not to take that approach. Each bespoke submission will be assessed on its own scheme-specific merits, and we will be judging them against the regulations and the code. So,
Andrew's now going to tell you a bit more about our fast track parameters themselves. Andrew.
Thanks, Chris. In our first consultation on the code, we proposed linking the fast track parameters to the strength of the covenant. However, after careful consideration, we are proposing to set one fast track line for TPs and investments based on the maturity of the scheme. There will also be one universal recovery plan length for all schemes that have yet to reach significant maturity. There are a few reasons for this, which we have set out in our consultation. Firstly, it has the benefit of being simple and avoids the situation where, for example, the trustees think that the covenant strength is strong and have based their approach on that and think they meet fast track, but we think the covenant is fairly weak and therefore disagree that they are fast track compliant. Secondly, one line is consistent with the behaviours of the majority of the DB scheme universe. And thirdly, schemes with covenants that can support more risk will be able to take a more flexible, scheme-specific approach and do a bespoke submission. In our consultation, we have put out some proposed parameters and have explained how we have set them. This includes the underlying investment strategies and de-risking patterns we have used. Let's look at some of those parameters now. Firstly, I want to talk about the low dependency assumptions. To meet fast track, the low dependency discount rate needs to be no higher than gilts plus a half, and the inflation assumption needs to be in line with market expectations. We have also provided some guidance on how we expect the other assumptions to be set to meet fast track. Both the parameters for TPs and the stress test, which provides an indication of the level of a scheme's investment risk, are based on the low dependency liabilities. When the scheme has a duration of 12 years, so has reached significant maturity, we expect TPs to be in line with low dependency and the stress test parameter, which represents the maximum change in the low dependency funding level for a fully funded scheme, to be just under 2%. For a 20-year duration scheme, which was where a typical scheme was in 2021, the parameter for TPs is 85% of low dependency liabilities, and the stress test parameter is a movement of just over 13% on the low dependency funding level. The parameter for RP length is 6 years for those schemes before significant maturity, then 3 years for those who have passed it. To meet fast track, there can be no allowance for assumed investment outperformance in the recovery plan, but trustees can allow for actual post-valuation experience assessed properly with both the assets and liabilities looked at. And you can have some inflation linking in your deficit contributions. We've also made an allowance for open schemes in how the parameters are applied. Schemes can allow for expected future accrual and new entrants for up to 6 years when testing their TPs. This means trustees can allow for these new benefits in calculating their maturity. This leads to a higher duration number and so lower parameters against which to test the scheme's TPs. Our modelling suggests that at the end of March 2021, over 50% of schemes met all fast track parameters, while nearly 95% met parameters in at least one of the 3 areas. To finish our presentation, I want to take you through a quick case study to bring to life the different approaches trustees can take to risk-taking in the journey plan. This case study will cover 2 similar schemes doing actuarial valuations in 2024. They both have the same maturity, with a duration of 17 years, and are expecting to reach significant maturity in about 13 years' time in 2037. As we talked about earlier, there are many different approaches that might suit the specific circumstances of the scheme, and it is for the trustees and employer to decide which to take. We will now look at a couple now. As a reminder, Here is a chart which shows the discount rates based on the maximum level of supportable risk that we looked at earlier. The trustees of Scheme A carry out a covenant assessment to determine the period of reliability over the employer's available cash to fund the scheme, the longevity of the covenant and the maximum level of supportable risk. Good visibility over the employer's cash flows and an assessment of the employer's prospects gives the trustees confidence that they can take a maximum supportable risk over a 6-year reliability period. When it comes to covenant longevity, they currently do not have confidence on the longevity of the employer beyond around 12 years. This isn't because of any particular event that is expected to happen, but because the prospects of the employer become less clear after this time. The trustees have decided they want to take the maximum supportable risk initially for the full reliability period of 6 years, and then de-risk in a linear way down to a low dependency basis after that. Given the covenant longevity period, the trustees assume a more rapid linear de-risking approach than the maximum supportable, moving to low dependency over a period of 4 years. This means the de-risking would complete by 2034, 10 years after the valuation date. Thereafter, the plan is to have a low dependency investment allocation and to use a low dependency discount rate of gilts plus a half. The resulting technical provisions are 93% of the low dependency liabilities. For Scheme B, the trustees' covenant assessment concluded a 6-year reliability period, in line with Scheme A, and a similar level of maximum supportable risk. However, the trustees' assessment of covenant longevity is longer than Scheme A at 16 years. This reflects the employer's industry, which gives the trustees greater certainty over its prospects. The trustees and employer want to limit volatility during the journey plan and avoid significant deterioration in the funding level, which could result in big calls on the employer's resources. So as covenant longevity extends further than Scheme A and beyond significant maturity, they decide to take a lower for longer approach. They plan to take lower levels of risk than the maximum supportable, but this extends beyond the covenant reliability period before de-risking to a low dependency position in 2037, when the scheme is expected to reach significant maturity. The low dependency discount rates is gilts plus a half like Scheme A. The total risk assumed in the plan is still within the limits defined by the maximum risk test. Although starting from a lower level, the planned de-risking is delayed until 2035, just 2 years before significant maturity. At this time, it will be important for the trustees to carefully consider how the de-risking will be carried out in practice to avoid crystallising losses during a period of underperformance and allowing sufficient time for illiquid assets to be disinvested. The resultant technical provisions are 93% of the low dependency liabilities, the same as Scheme A. So the two very different approaches shown on this slide result in the same TPs. How might these strategies compare to Fast Track? Well, both meet the requirements in terms of a low dependency funding basis, and both have technical provisions higher than the Fast Track parameter of 91.5% of low dependency for duration 17. However, when it comes to the stress test, there is a difference in the two schemes. Applying the stress test to Scheme A comes out with a change in the low dependency funding level of 13%, and applying it to Scheme B results in a change of 9%. This compares to the Fast Track parameter of 11.4%, meaning Scheme B meets the parameter and Scheme A doesn't. So the valuation for Scheme A must be through bespoke, but the trustees of the scheme can demonstrate that Covenant is able to support the risk being taken in the scheme's investment strategy over the next few years. And now I will hand back to Chris.
Great, many thanks, Andrew. Before we move into our final Q&A session, we're going to take a short break again to to give you a couple of minutes to submit your questions. So again, please just click on the box under the video player, type your nice, easy questions and press submit, and we'll be back in 2 minutes. Thank you. Great. Welcome back, everyone. Looks like we have plenty of questions. There's no shortage of people wanting to quiz the panel. So I'm going to kick off straight away. First question, what allowance can be made for commutation in fast track? So I'll go to Andrew for that one, if that's okay.
Yes, thanks, Chris. Definitely for me, that one. So the short answer is that you can make the normal allowance for commutation in line with our guidance we set out in the code. And something that has come up a few times before. Apologies, I think some of our wording in the fast track consultation document wasn't particularly clear. We talked about other options and said that you can only allow for other options if it doesn't reduce the liabilities. Just to clarify, what we meant by other options there was the same other options that we said in Appendix 3 of a code. So when it comes to commutation, you can use the usual approach of looking at how much a member's been commuting their pension for cash and build that into your fast track assumptions as you would in a normal valuation. And it is something we will clarify in the final fast track guidance.
Lovely, thanks Andrew. Next question, in assessing the covenant strength of a UK company owned by an overseas parent, can the stronger position of the parent be taken into account if the local company is weaker, e.g. balance sheet cash, etc.? That sounds like very much a covenant and financial analyst question. So Katrina, can I give that to you?
Absolutely. So it's really important when trustees are assessing their employer covenant that they are looking at the entities that they have that have a legal obligation to support the scheme. So this would be the sponsoring employers. In this situation that they're talking about where you've got the overseas parent company, you wouldn't be able to take into account that when assessing your employer covenant unless you had a legally binding guarantee from that parent company. So it has to be legally binding and be able to provide the value required at that point in time. Just to note on guarantees in particular, we also introduced the concept of a look-through guarantee. So this is an all bells and whistles guarantee. So it will cover the full Section 75 deficit, be evergreen and missed deficit repair contributions, but it also provides a formal look-through to affordability to the guarantor. In this situation, you would be able to assume the guarantor's covenant when assessing, assume the guarantor's strength of covenant when assessing the covenant. However, in all other situations where the guarantee doesn't meet this criteria, the onus is on the trustees to understand what additional risk can be taken as a result of having that guarantee.
Lovely, thank you, Katrina. Next question, I'd be interested to know how trustees are able to take into account favourable investment terms, e.g. guaranteed annuity rates, and still be viewed as complying with the fast track parameters. Sorry, Andrew, that's probably another one for you. Yes,
you'll give me all the difficult ones, like you said, Chris. So we are aware that there are a lot of schemes out there have got insured policies which have these guaranteed annuity rates. And it's something we've been talking about with DWP actually to how we make sure that the regulations and the code work for those types of schemes. When it comes to doing fast track, that is something we're going to have to think about a bit further. I think in general, when it comes to the technical provisions, it shouldn't be a problem, but we can see that there could be some issues with the low dependency requirement, at the end of a journey plan.
Great, thank you. And just to give you a break, I'm going to target David with the next one. By requiring schemes to be sufficiently de-risked at the point of significant maturity, regardless of covenant support, does that point towards maturity having primacy over covenant rather than the other way around?
Well, I think as Andrew was saying earlier, by the time of significant maturity, the vast majority of members have become pensioners. There's quite significant levels of cash outflow. So the ability of the scheme to bounce back, I think, is quite challenged. When DWP did their consultation on the regulations within question 9, they did ask the question, should there be more flexibility beyond that point? And I think I have a degree of sympathy for those employers who are saying, well, this might lead to trapped surplus. if actually there are mechanisms such as escrow accounts or bank guarantees that preserve the security of members' benefits but provide more flexibility, then I think that's something that we could look at. I don't have huge amounts of sympathy with an IOU from the employer in the pension scheme at that point. Some people have challenged me and said, well, if there's a really strong employer, really strong positive cash flow, and the pension scheme is quite small, why does the employer have to put the money into the scheme? I suppose I would counter that by saying, well, actually, if it's a really small pension scheme and it's a very large employer, the employer should be able to put money aside to ensure the security of members' benefits. So I think, you've got to look at the situation that schemes are in by significant maturity and the security of members' benefits. As I say, there might be ways of providing flexibility. That's something that we're in discussion with DWP about.
Great, thank you, David. Very nice topical question, which is headed your way, Neil. Which asset classes are really low risk, given the volatility in all assets expected over the longer term?
Thank you. So I think this is really goes to perhaps the heart of how you think about risk. And I wonder if the motivation of the question is whether you look at sort of asset-only risk or the risk relative to your liabilities. So from an asset-only point of view, you might argue that cash has the lowest level of risk. Unfortunately, that doesn't help. It doesn't do particularly well when moving in line with your liabilities. So I think for that reason, it's it's important, and many schemes do this already. I mentioned it earlier in terms of some of the statistics. Many pension schemes invest in various types of bonds as they mature. We'd expect that to continue anyway. So I think the volatility question really comes down to how you measure risk, and we're very clear that we want that measured relative to the liabilities. And in fact, we put that into the code, whether schemes follow the fast track PPF stress test or decide their own test. In both ways, we want them to measure the risk of their assets relative to the liabilities, because that's ultimately the way of protecting members' benefits.
Great, thank you, Neil. Is there any recommended measure for covenant strength, strong, weak, percentage? Katrina?
So as I mentioned earlier, we are wanting to move away from using covenant grading, so your strong to weak ratings. The reason being is they are very subjective. What we have found in the past, particularly when we've been engaging on these things, you can go back and forth about what is the covenant rating, and ultimately you need to end up drilling down into the three key areas of covenant that we've talked about: your cash, your contingent assets, and your prospects. We appreciate that covenant ratings can be a helpful benchmark to understand how things have changed or how the covenant has changed, but certainly for the purposes of being able to evidence that the risk that you are taking is supportable by the covenant, we will be requiring detail on each of those three elements.
Great, thank you. Next one's, I think, probably for you, Ian, if that's okay. What will happen where trustees and companies do not agree what they are required to agree?
I think this relates to the funding and investment strategy, where the employer and the trustees have to agree under the regulations. I think if this is not the first time that such a strategy has been put in place, then we would expect that in these circumstances the old one will continue until a new agreement can be reached. If this is the first time and there is a real impasse between the trustees and the employer in terms of agreeing this, and we were unable to sort of resolve it using sort of soft powers, then we would have to look at the powers that we retain as TPR and see which ones, if any, we could use to try and help resolve the situation.
Great, thank you. Next question, is there any flexibility for schemes who are already at significant maturity? Is there any sort of transition period to help them comply? I might give the panel a break and answer this one. So I think there's two aspects to this. Firstly, whether the regulations will have any transition period applied to them. And secondly, what's in the existing regulations as we see them at the moment that would help with this issue for trustees. So on the first question, it's something that we know DWP have had some responses to their consultation asking for a bit more information about this and potentially asking for a transition period. So it's something that we know that they're likely to consider as part of their consultation responses. The other aspect that's relevant, I think, to this is around the level at which actual investment strategies have to mirror what's in the funding and investment strategies. We talk in our code and our consultation document around generally we expect them to follow each other, but there might be some circumstances where actual investment strategies can diverge. So there might be something in there that will help answer some of this question as well. So I'll move on to the next question. Back to you, Andrew. I think for the scheme which is still open to new members, when is it considered to be matured?
Yeah, so we talked a bit about open schemes earlier and how we'd expect trustees to plan for open schemes in terms of their funding. I think what this question is really getting at is, well, what happens if you stay open to new members and you don't actually head towards significant maturity? And I think it is important to distinguish between, with open schemes, your plan for funding and how that scheme plays out in practice in terms of maturing in the investment strategy. So we do expect trustees to plan for the scheme to close at some point in the future, because you cannot be certain that the scheme will remain open, and to fund in that way. However, if you come back in the next valuation 3 years' time, you've still got the covenant supporting the scheme, it's still able to carry on providing benefits, and you're still staying open to new members, you may find that the scheme is not maturing. You can carry on investing in a similar way, and that can carry on indefinitely. So actually, it could be that these schemes, they never reach significant maturity as long as they stay open to new members and as long as the flow of new members is replacing the pensioners at the other end.
Great, thank you. This one looks very much for you, Neil. How does the 4.5% stress test link with the fast track 1.9%, both at duration 12? Will a lot of schemes then fall into bespoke unless they can drop to the 1.9?
Okay, thank you for the question, Chris. So I think it's worth, just for those folks that are less familiar with those numbers, the 4.5% is the piece we talk about being sort of the outer edge of bespoke, and the 1.9% is the fast track number, and those numbers are for a scheme at significant maturity. I think the short answer to this is no. I don't think it will lead to that impact. There's a few reasons for that. One, we mentioned earlier, schemes are already well on their way to a low risk position. And in fact, events of the last year, although quite challenging for many schemes in terms of liquidity, in terms of funding levels, many schemes have seen their funding levels have improved and taken the opportunity to perhaps de-risk quicker than they thought they would be. So many schemes are already well on their way, as I say. They have good levels of hedging, and so that risk number will continue to come down, and they may find themselves comfortably within that fast track number by the time they're significantly mature. Of course, remember that number's for significant maturity, not necessarily for be a higher number for an average maturity scheme. But ultimately, there will be schemes that want to go down the bespoke route and run a greater level of risk, and David mentioned about sort of potentially running on, and that's absolutely fine, but we'll require greater evidence and ask more challenging and searching questions in that area than we would if a scheme went through fast track. And that's really the beauty of the fast track and bespoke approach.
Great, thank you, Neil. Next one, back to you, Andrew, I'm afraid. If a scheme has carried out a buy-in, should this change how the significant maturity date is determined?
So another good actuarial question. We're liking these. So the short answer, we think, is no. We think it's best to treat a buy-in as another investment of the scheme. So actually, you've just changed some of your investments in something else into a buy-in. So actually, the significant maturity date would stay the same. What that means in practice, of course, is that it would also be reflected in your investments. And the buy-in is obviously a very safe investment. You can't, other than buying out, you really can't get any more safe. So that would also be factored then into the sort of risk analysis you do on the investment strategy.
Great. Excuse me, sorry. Next question, how will you review fast track in future? For example, will you consult on any changes? There's a short and long answer to this question. I think the short answer is yes, we will consult on changes. We included some proposals for how we might go about this in our fast track consultation document. There's questions in there around whether we would do it every year, whether we would take a longer period, perhaps do it every 3 years, and also around the level of detail that we might take in carrying out that review. So we're asking quite open questions about what industry think would be most helpful or looks most sensible. But yes, the short answer is yes, we would consult before we would make changes to fast track. I think we are running short of... final question. Yes, we are running short of questions because I've been labelled the final question. Fast track seems to be fast for TPR but doesn't seem to reduce the burden of compliance on pension schemes. Could you comment on this? I might give that to David as it's the last question and it's not that easy.
Yeah, so I think we've been very conscious as we've developed the code, and we've been particularly conscious of those third of schemes that got less than 100 members, trying to get the balance right. So clearly we have to gather enough information to make ourselves comfortable that the level of risk is appropriate and give us the ability to intervene when we think it's right to do so. Having said that, we are looking at the use of technology, how we gather the information, what information we gather. There'll be a consultation on that in the summer, and we're trying to use technology to minimise the burden on schemes and make it as easy as it can be for you to provide that information to us to regulate. So absolutely hear what you say. We will try and minimise the burden, but at the end of the day we do have to gather enough information to make sure that schemes are operating in accordance with the regulations and our code.
Great, thank you very much, and I just want to say thank you to everyone on the panel for their participation in today's webinar, and you as well. Thank you, audience, for being so engaging and asking such excellent and challenging questions. Before we go, I'm going to hand over to David first to close the webinar, but just before I do, we actually, because this is very close to David's time leaving TPR, so as well as asking you to submit questions for this webinar, we asked for some thoughts on David that we could read out to him. I believe somebody's filtered out any of the swear words, but I've got a few here that I thought I'd want to read out. So I've chosen 3, or we've chosen 3 here. I was lucky enough to start working with the ACA at the time David was chair. His drive to help people and solve technical challenges in the industry was inspiring and infectious, and a big part in my wanting to do the same role someday. You can probably guess where that might be coming from. It's been great working more recently with David in his TPR role, and I wish him all the best for the future. Next one, David's worn the crown of the most get this word right, the most unflappable man in pensions through a period of amazing industry stresses. His personal network and collegiate style has brought the people being regulated and those doing the regulating closer together, which is ultimately beneficial for savers. His leadership has helped orient DB schemes towards the great pensions runoff, and he leaves behind a talented team, I like that bit, to see it through to implementation. Whilst we'll miss David in his TPR role, I'm sure he'll pop up somewhere new and continue helping people save well for their later lives. And then just finally, then I will hand over to David. I've known David for 20 years. We are of an age. I'm not sure what that means. He is a good man. He has managed the policy role at TPR with great tact and aplomb. He is, by all accounts, a very good actuary too. So on that note, I will hand over to David.
Thank you. And obviously I wasn't aware that the team were going to do that, and that probably the unflappable bit might have actually gone by the board a bit. But thank you, Chris, for that. Firstly, just some housekeeping. You'll be able to download the slides from this session and the webinar recording. It will be available to watch again in a few days' time if you want to put yourself through that an hour and a half all over again. You'll also be able to find additional and supportive information about that in our useful links doc located in the resource tab in the delegate area. We'd love to hear your views on the webinar, so please fill out our survey. That can be found at the top of the menu to the left-hand side of this video player. But lastly, I just want to say thank you to my fellow panel members, to all the people back in Brighton who've made this an amazing journey. Thank you.